I'm doing my presentation on an article by Anttila called Analogy, the Warp and Woof of Cognition. The article talks about the importance of the phenomenon of analogy within the theory of linguistics as well as human experience. Particularly, the article focuses on the modern tendencies in linguistics, which demonstrate some ignorance towards the earlier achievements in linguistics and its principles, which since the ancient times included analogy within the toolbox of linguistics theory. The article is divided into 8 parts, 7 of which discuss the different aspects of the importance of analogy within the theory of linguistics as well as the overall human experience, while the introductory part provides some overall insight into the matter. Since the article uses some very condensed language in order to avoid confusion, I will mostly follow the order of the article with some variation mixing the introductory chapter with the first chapter, since the first chapter introduces some very general terms about the topic. Another important deviation from the order of the chapters in the article and in my presentation will reflect the discussion of the chapter 2. I will present chapter 2 in the end of my presentation, since I would like to demonstrate the grounds for my own response to the article based on the most vivid evidences which are most noticeable in chapter 2. Despite the fact that chapter 2 seems to touch upon the analysis of the most fundamental matter discussed within the article, each chapter is written in a more or less autonomous manner, which is why I hope that this substitution of the order for the chapter 2 will not induce any confusion into my presentation. Overall, it could be said that analogy is a relation of similarities. Humans employ analogy as one of the prime methods to organize their perception and understanding of the world. For example, to understand and learn about the nature of unknown or a new phenomenon, people often draw similarities and correlate the unknown with the known phenomenon. As such, the analogy with the water waves led to the understanding of the sound waves, then to the understanding of light waves, as well as to the overall interpretation of the phenomenon of waves. Within the cultural networks and mythologies, humans used the analogy to organize the social order through the development of the idea that state is to its member as a father is to his child. On the other hand, it could be concluded that analogy is also a ground for analytical contemplations. Since the ancient times, analogy has been an inherent constituent of the scientific thinking, where a clever and acute representation of the analogy has been a diagram. Ever since the ancient Greek era, the traditional scientific representation of the analogy had the form of the analogical grid, consisting of contiguity and similarity axes. Using this schematic representation, it could be said that analogy signifies correspondences between entities that cover any kind of relations, which could be expressed through the structure A to B is analogous to C to D. Anttila claims that this grid helped Aristotle to define categories, genera in ancient Greek. Genera was the topic and the title of one of Aristotle's early works. Moreover, genera was one of the fundamental concepts in his monumental work, Metaphysics. On the figure on the right, there is an empty gap X, which represents the space to be filled in by analogy. One of the methods to determine the value of the empty space X is represented by the numbers, which render identical relations. For example, if it is given that 4 divided by 2 equals 10 divided by x, then x equals 5. Applying the analogy grid in linguistics, it is important to note that the form of a word is as important as the meaning of the word. However, the meaning of the word is sometimes ignored, which disbalances the results of the analysis. On this figure, Anttila offers to consider the boxes as a rough schematic representations of words. The top part of each box stands for the meaning, while the bottom part stands for the form. This representation shows that the similarity relations exist both in the meaning and the form. The shapes of the boxes correlate with the diversities of the meanings and the forms of the words. The following figure shows that words 2 and 5 share the same meaning, while the words 1 and 4 have the same form. If a transformation of the word will take place, the words with the same form represented by the boxes 1 and 4 would work towards changing the meaning from box 1 to box 4 or vice versa. Instead, boxes 2 and 5 show that the forms of the words could also change either way, while the meaning will remain. The actual change will depend on the strength of the context, culture, grammar, or other factors. The words represented by the boxes 2 and 5 could also have a change in allomorphy, such as the number, gender, and case word endings. The words from boxes Y and Z could also have such changes since the meaning is identical. Since the ancient Greek era, the tendency of the word alterations has always strived towards an ideal position, one form, one meaning. However, because the language is a live entity, other variations occur. The analogy and rationality are the main forces that initiate changes in words. Usually, the changes follow a principle that result in either V, which stands for two meanings, one form, or lambda, which stands for one meaning, two forms. The changes result in either one word represented by I or split into two words, two I's. The allomorphic lambda alterations work similarly and either split into independent I and I, for example, the words shade and shadow, which have different meanings. Or the words merge into one form, for example, the words cow and king, where the word king is the archaic form of the plural for the word cow. As we know, the word cow now has only one form. The situation in 1 and 4 on figure 10.4 represents so-called homonymic clash, which means that a word has the same form or sound, but two meanings. If a change occurs, formal differentiation is expected. To illustrate this situation, the author refers to an example of German word Englich, meaning angelic, and the same form of the word Englich, which also means English. In different situations, the use of the word Englich brought insidious conflicts, which is why the Englich meaning angelic was replaced by Engelhaft, restoring the principle one meaning one form. Anttila points out that any interpretation which was successfully adopted by the perception can potentially initiate analogical changes in other instances. For example, the French word cerise, meaning cherry, in an English-speaking environment was interpreted having plural ending s. Then, following the analogy, singular form cherry emerged. Form to meaning transformations appear everywhere in language, structure, and use. For example, a change pertaining general semantic similarity pulling towards one meaning, one form principle occurred between American English and Finnish. In Finnish, there are words likina, meaning pencil, penseli, meaning both paintbrush and regular brush, and harja, meaning brush. But in American Finnish, following the analogy with the principle one meaning, one form, the similarity between the forms of the Finnish word penseli and the English word pencil resulted in retaining the semantics of the English pencil with the Finnish word penseli, while the Finnish word harja now covers the entire spectrum of the word brush. There are many examples of this kind around the world. In Chapter 3, talking about analogy and metaphor, Anttila claims that within the patterns of cognition, the similarity and contiguity manifest as the metaphor and metonymy. He also claims that within this context, there is no difference between metaphor and analogy. Anttila holds that the principles of metaphor and analogy were well recognized and used since the ancient times, while the recent abolishment of analogy from the toolbox of the linguistic theory was mindless incompetence. Though the reappearance of these principles in the optimality theory, which observes language forms to come from the satisfaction of conflicting constraints, has compensated the loss to some extent. According to Anttila, the reasons for abolishing analogy from the linguistic theory has to do with distinctness and thus the analytical comforts associated with the duality within the cognition of relevant conceptions. The distinctness in duality is opposed by some complications associated with analogy, which some linguists see as mixing the distinctness in the duality of relevant conceptions. For example, the following dual pairs could be seen as matching analogy. In the cases of these pairs, analogies seem to mix the distinctions between the words. Because of this, some linguists say that explaining everything with metaphor does not explain anything. In response, Anttila argues that within the application of analogy, the context should never be ignored, since it is the crucial anchoring factor that provides orientation. Finally, Anttila stresses that within the theory of semantic field, which organizes groups of words semantically, the shift between fields would not be possible without metaphor, which in this situation is equal to analogy. Chapter 4 reveals that analogy is often equated with induction, which Anttila finds correct, since in the computational paradigm, problem solving should be associated with induction, abduction, analogy, or analogical abduction. Using the example of metaphor, one can trace the working of cognition. Anttila claims that the recognition of the metaphor identification includes two important elements, which he calls an index and an icon. A metaphor cannot do without an index launchpad, which indicates semantic tension and dissimilarities in the logic of speech. That is, the metaphor index is something that indicates a certain semantic discrepancy. These tensions and dissimilarities sharpen attention to the metaphor and initiate the search for a solution to the discrepancy. This discrepancy hides the veiled meaning, which Anttila calls an icon. Explaining this mechanism, he gives an example of an allegory that compares the index of the metaphor with a photograph that reliably points to an object represented by its iconic image. If the search is successful and the veiled expression finds identification within the icon, that is, an object that restores the logic of the semantic meaning, then the statement is confirmed as a metaphor. Roughly speaking, we can say that the search for meaning is based on perception and abduction filling empty space. But in the full process of search for the meaning of the metaphor, grounded on the empirical context, cognition seeks for the solution of inconsistency through analogy, which in turn mixes abduction, induction, and practical syllogism in order to solve the problem. Thus, the analogy can be perceived as the means for the solution in this situation. This also shows that analogy is crucial in any science as it improves explanations within theories and supports the discovered hypothesis. In the fifth chapter, Anttila discusses the possibility of giving classification to the analogy. Based on the dynamics of correlation between indexicality and similarity, there was an assumption that there should be some typological order behind the analogical transformations, which could be recognized as patterns and classes of analogy. However, Anttila argues that finding a measurable order within analogical transformations isn't viable because such an order would need to be based on an identical perception within an identical context, which is unlikely to be the case in the reality. Context, just as perception, vary quite significantly. As such, the result of the analogical transformation could be quite diverse and difficult to predict. Thus, the recognition of patterns within analogy and the following classification of analogy cannot be reliable. In other words, science cannot measure unpredictable parameters and render regularities or order within analogy so to classify the analogy appropriately. Speaking of the recent history in linguistics, Anttila mentions that up to the 1960s, the regularities in linguistics largely derived from analogy, which was particularly evident in morphology, where the word endings followed a particular paradigm depending, for example, on the case, gender, and number of the words. The roots of this state of affairs extend back to the era of the ancient Greece, where analogy was interpreted as a regularity manifested through the examples of paradigms. It all went well since working with grammatical facts was particularly suitable to be handled through analogy, which is notably useful to work with immaterial subjects inaccessible for direct observation. However, around the 1960s, the newly proposed generative phonology and generative grammar rejected the principles of analogy in linguistics. Instead, the generative phonology, which represents the correct phonetic characteristics reflecting a native speaker's internalized grammar, offered phonological rules that explain the dynamics in grammar. Opposing the positions of the generative phonology, Anttila offered analysis illustrating how analogy works in life and theory, claiming that after the generative phonology theory became fashionable, most linguists adopted the views of this theory because it was prestigious and because the proliferation of this theory guaranteed well-paying jobs. Applying this situation on the analogy grid, Anttila identified the axis of analogy with the contemporary prestige and future success, while the axis of icon he identified with the adoption and acceptance of the new theory by the scholars who wished to succeed. This analogical behavioral pattern is quite embodied in life and demonstrates countless examples when people repeat after those who they find prestigious and successful. Such analogical patterns of behavior have many traces in linguistics too. For example, wishing to be associated with those who have prestige and success, people often mimic their heroes and adopt their styles, including the manner of pronunciation. Then this pronunciation manner proliferates from one particular group of people to another group, and so on until the change in pronunciation is generally recognized and becomes a norm within a larger group of people. Such linguistic changes in social environment are recognized as dialect. However, within linguistics, these analogical changes may occur not only in phonology, but also in semantics and grammar. Finally, Anttila mentions that many principles in methods which are offered in the modern linguistics under various fancy terms such as optimization consists of principles and methods which in essence are analogy. Thus, what was rejected as analogy reappeared as disguised and distorted variation of analogy. Anttila begins the final chapter by endorsing a book about the phenomenon of analogy written by Holyak and Thagard. Despite the fact that the book revises a period only starting the 1980 and considers only English literature, Anttila claims that this is the best work on analogy written in the past 2,000 years. Then Anttila provides his summary of the book, stating that analogy is the cognitive glory of humans. The development of analogy is evident in children, scientists, religion, culture, and empathy. Analogy has to be used in problem-solving, decision-making, persuasion, and communication, as well as any kind of learning or human activity. Anttila concludes the article by stating that humans are simply analogical animals, and that language as well as its structure are predominantly analogical, which is why analogy is the backbone of the universal grammar. Prior to the discussion of the chapter 2, I would like to mention that I decided to alter the mode of my presentation for this chapter, since after lengthy consideration, various approaches, and diverse attempts to make a coherent presentation of this chapter, I came to the following conclusions. Since I am presenting an article about analogy written by Anttila Remo, I should try to present the most useful material I could render from this particular article. This means that I should not fill in the empty gaps which the article is full of, and unless it's a matter of filling in some minor complementary information, I should not provide information from the outer sources that explain what was not explained in this chapter. With that, I must mention that in order to fill in the gaps with the material from the chapter itself, as well as to find the logic and the roadmap for penetration into this particular chapter, I decompose the chapter into smallest phrases that make up the sentences which shape the chapter. I combine these phrases in different orders based on the semantic meanings of the phrases and the key words, as well as reorder different sections and reassemble the pieces in many different ways according to the semantics and topics, all in vain. In this chapter, there is absolutely no coherent order or logic which may lead the reader to the understanding of the chapter without multiple references to some outer sources in order to guess what the author might have meant by writing what he wrote. Therefore, I decided to demonstrate this state of affair by quoting Anttila's writing. The quote will start from the very beginning of the chapter and will be supplemented with my own comments, which will simultaneously render my response to the article, all of which will follow with my conclusions. Chapter 2, Transposition and Analogy, begins by an announcement that all cognition is based on relation and order that is Gestalt. Without giving any further explanation about the nature, working, or the benefit of Gestalt phenomena, from the second sentence of this chapter, Anttila jumps right into a conclusion of another author, stating that Gestalt is ultimately based on relations because it is the total relation of relations. What is the logic here, and how did this conclusion come about? Why is the reader supposed to assume that the Gestalt is the total relation of relations? Taking into consideration the fact that the entire area related to Gestalt was emerged only after the emergence of Freud's psychoanalysis in the 20th century, why does the author assume that the term Gestalt, which belongs to the professional terminology of psychology and not linguistics, should be known to the reader, especially within the interpretation of the author? Are we supposed to assume that the reference to the term is some sort of general concept or an axiom which should be plainly clear? Interestingly enough, Anttila provides a note number 4 here. However, the note talks about the volume Anttila is referring to and states that this volume is very important. Nothing about the explanation of the term. Meanwhile, the chapter continues, and the third sentence of the chapter states that the most crucial concept in all of this is the transposition, since gestalts are invariants of transposition and similarities of correspondences. Because, and here Anttila refers to another author, who in turn refers to a different author, concluding that for whatever one would mean by Gestalt, the transposibility of Gestalt has to be taken as its essential property, as already von Ehrenfels tried to show. Since the last quote starts with a clause for whatever one would mean by Gestalt, should the reader conclude that the meaning of Gestalt is unimportant as long as the transposibility of Gestalt is taken as its essential property? Then are the transposibility and Gestalts the same things? What exactly is the point of the author here? Nevertheless, Anttila continues with another quote. We have verified that one essential site is in symbol function is connected with intermodal transposibility and odd analogical extension. Whether or not one understands what Gestalt is, how exactly was this statement verified, and how exactly does the essential aside of the symbol function connected with transposibility? There was no one single mentioning of the concept of symbol prior to this. How did this merge? Nevertheless, the quote continues. Here one sees the connection of symbol function with Gestalt formation. No, the connection was not shown, and the entire logic is unclear. The only statements were that for some unknown reason Gestalt is the total relation of relations, The gestalts are invariants of transpositions, and the gestalt is the most crucial, and the transposition is the most crucial concept. Okay, since none of the above was clear, questioning what the function of symbol is won't be reasonable, I guess. Let's assume that a gestalt formation has connection with the symbol function. Anttila continues by stating his expectation that the reader, for some unknown reason, should assume that the organs forming the gestalt reach the environments contained in the multiplicity of receptor excitation. Without going into the debris of neuroscience, I should nevertheless mention that the term receptor within the context of the human functioning has a precise definition of a specific biological cell which, when it is excited by a very specific natural or physical causes, it initiates very specific chemical reactions that induce very specific electric charges, which are sent to the central nervous system of an organism. What exactly is the connection to the gestalts? Anyway, Anttila quotes of another author continues. I call the principle in this assumption the principle of invariance of perception. Invariance means here the unifiedly recurring relations in the different areas with multiplicity of excitation. Without going into a number of other important questions, upon this statement for other unknown reasons, the reader apparently should again conclude what was referred to as another quote that followed. Thus, the process of consciousness is from beginning to end a search for invariants, finding them, and partially also creating them. At this point, taking into consideration the fact that the entire chapter as well as the entire article is written in more or less the same manner and style, as soon as the author claimed what the process of consciousness is, I was completely discouraged to understand what exactly the author is trying to say for several reasons. Never once mentioning about the process of consciousness, the author claimed that the process of consciousness is from beginning to end a search for invariants. I find this claim to be extremely frivolous, especially that this very question of the process of consciousness is the number one concern for the entire area of artificial intelligence research. In spite of the fact that the discussed material has occupied a half of a page, I do not see any reasonably convincing grounds for a connection between all of the concepts and ideas discussed. The reader is not provided with the author's own roadmap for the connection of all of these vague concepts and ideas. Meanwhile, the concepts and the ideas are way too vague to ignore the grounds of the author's own interpretation and viewpoint upon which the perception of the concepts and the ideas should unfold in the reader's mind. The whole material, which seems to entirely consist of the ideas, language, and styles of other authors, was just irresponsibly thrown at the reader without a clear explanation of the importance of these ideas, their order, weight, as well as the definitions of the concepts precisely from the view angle at which the author understands them within the context of his own claim. Instead, the author continually withdraws ideas of other people out of the context of these ideas and blends them into a postmodern mess which he presents as his own writing. Additionally, the author did not convince me that he has a good understanding of what he is talking about precisely because he continuously refers to and quotes other authors throughout the entire chapter as well as the entire work. Moreover, he continuously jumps from one very rich concept to another as rich concepts, never explaining the precise determination of these concepts and their importance within the context. Meanwhile, the context is unclear too, precisely because he jumps from one concept to another without any meaningful links, as if he is discussing the most straightforward matter. Overwhelming the reader with erudition or an imitation of it does not help the reader to recognize and understand the point the author is making. This is rather a tactic that induces the reader to accept the author's point upon trust, since otherwise the reader would need to define and verify each and every component involved within the logic and the claim of the author. I think any argument or point making should be determined by an acute formula, which in its turn should be determined by a clear roadmap of the order of interaction between the concepts that define the formula and render the point. Finally, since Anttila provides no clear explanation of his own standing and substitutes his own thoughts with the thoughts of other authors, I conclude that either the author has nothing to say, or he wants to drop the responsibility of what is expressed in his writing on other authors. In all cases, neither is a responsible manner of treating the reader. Meanwhile, I totally refuse to accept any idea which is not provided with a cleansing clarity, since I believe that it is very irresponsible to assume any idea just because it exists or offers any hypothesis. I believe the cause of all troubles in the world comes from the irresponsible assumption of unverified, vague, and unclear ideas. These unverified ideas always misguide and, if accepted, may lead to serious consequences, including the global ones, which we can presently observe having their impact around the world.